Hey everybody, thanks for joining me. This will be a slightly unusual recording in that I'm going out for a walk to get some exercise, and it's nighttime, so probably won't help you to see what the camera can capture of that. And I'd prefer not to be holding my phone, so I'm just going to do a recording on the headset mic. And I'm not sure how that'll work out. There might be a lot of noise, there might be occasional noise. We'll see how it goes. And then lastly, I'm going to be walking up a series of fairly steep hills. One of them's about a half a mile long. So you're going to hear a lot of my breathing. And there's not too much I can do about that. But as long as you're okay with those variables, I'm fine with them too. And my mind is kind of awake at the moment. So I thought it would be nice to explore some of the things that are floating around on the surface. And I guess I'll start with some stuff that wasn't actually on my mind until I started thinking about talking. And I felt a little nervous, which isn't uncommon for me. You know, when people are sick or injured, we can see it pretty clearly. A lot of the time, not always. A lot of the pain that people we encounter, a lot of the pain they feel, it's hidden from us. And there's all kinds of strange social garbage in our anti-cultures that that makes it not safe to show our pain. There's a bunch of traditional crap and sort of little social psychopathologies that get enacted as trends in the supermarket of human, well, the relations that happen in the structured aspects of our culture. In the like, there's different. Part of the problem that I'm having trying to talk about this is that the idea of a society is too simple and too general an idea. There really isn't any such thing. So I'm trying to refer to the layer of human behavior roles, which can be momentary, rules, habits, trends, stuff that's seen as cool or intelligent or appropriate. And for most of us, I think most of the societal aspects we will encounter they're like the fast food, or maybe even something worse, the plastic food of our human social potentials, and even the stuff we will do together when we have a context that nurtures and rewards and supports, or at least doesn't attack us, right? For being and learning and growing, which certainly means making mistakes, and probably means being hurt, sick, confused, broken, alone, especially when so tragically few of the contexts we will encounter are authentic enough to have the kind of spaciousness in terms of depth and diverse opportunities for role and learning and skill, acquisition and enaction and sharing. So even when we do encounter contexts that somewhat support that, many of them either started out pre-compromised or become compromised over time as they contend with the cultures in which they exist, the supercultures, and might be thought of like beautiful little islands, right? Where some of the finest expressions and potentials of our humanity are at least momentarily embodied, because people will come together and choose to do this together. And there's lots of stuff that mimics that. In fact, it goes all the way from slight mimicry to abject mimicry to ironic, plastic garbage, right? So again, there's layers of authenticity and humanness. But for most of us, we're going to find ourselves in contexts where we quickly will learn to hide. We will learn to buffer not merely our pain and confusion and fear and anxiety, but also our creativity, our inspiration, our unique personhood, and the process, the inward process of learning that is personal to each of us, and yet has many communal aspects and is ancient. It's really, really old. It's so old that the past 2,000 years of human activity are like an eye blink in its age. And each of us has this inside us. Or rather than use the container metaphor, our human forms and natures are enactions of these intelligences. Some of them absolutely primordial, some of them literally older than the age we think of that's associated with the physical universe. Some of them related to our unique biology, our form, our organs, our bilateral symmetry, our connected yet conflicted brain hemispheres and the cortex. So inside us there's a process going on. And the process is known only to us. And only in the rarest moments of deep communion with others, usually beloved others, but sometimes hated others, are we likely to surface some of the content that we have to hide and buffer from the world. And that process is a kind of torture, by the way. Well, the process of having to hide it is a kind of torture. And it's cruelly inhibitive. It's viciously inhibitive. Essentially, much of what we may think about when we think of the idea of rearing children is inhibiting them, right? Getting them to figure out what not to do. And that's an important thing to notice. And it's not necessarily bad outright, or, we can't make easy value judgments about it. But when you think about, when most of us, many of us anyway, depending on what's going on and where we are, when we think about raising children, mostly we think about, in language from my childhood, getting them to behave, right? And getting them to not misbehave. And that's a really bizarre polarity to embed in a child's consciousness. Some sorts of expressions of myself are not allowed. Right? It's a very confusing idea. Now again, we wouldn't want to throw the idea away, but it probably needs a vastly more nuanced treatment than what it will tend to get in the common, if we pick someone off the street. Although, again, the field of humans is profoundly diverse, and there are these little island paradises. Some of us become them. And sometimes we may only become them for a moment and then go back to being our ordinary self, so to speak, or our inhibited self, let's say. But when I was talking about how the contexts sometimes put up these little flowers, these little sort of paradisical tropical islands, right? Eventually, the pirates come. Someone comes from outside. And what I mean is, even our most intimately formed pods and groups and collectives, families, tribes, the sort of poisonous, duplicitous, representational culture leaks in and corrupts those little islands, much like, any tropical island that was colonized by people we might refer to as Europeans or others. So it's very difficult to sustain something authentic in contexts where the values and priorities are false or fictional. And when I say fictional, I don't mean we invented them. I mean they're the kind of a fiction that a lie is. And some of those lies can look quite factual, right? It's really easy to form them in language. Darren is 140 pounds. There's one. It's factual if the measurement's correct. And the measurements are always, they have a degree of error. But there's no content in there. It's just accounting, right? How much meat is there? It doesn't help you. It doesn't tell you anything about me, really, at all. Fictions. So, many of the attempts, some of them noble and good, that humans make to create contexts in which it's possible for us to be who we are, to see and say and act and feel and move in the ways that are natural to us and feel like ourselves. Those contexts are hard to sustain in a broad field of competing, hungry representational products, processes, institutions, companies. And almost all of them will have to be, they'll be infected with money. Right? Money's the evil it's tough to defect from. So what I was really thinking about was just how we can't see the pain of others. We can't see their suffering. They're hidden from us in their houses, in their cars, at the grill, at the restaurant, in the postmen and delivery drivers and the soldiers and the doctors and the nurses. The pain is all hidden. And there's a lot of it. There are mountains and mountains of it in the human world. And we don't see it. And so when we think about people in general, or we think about, why doesn't this person understand, or why are they behaving in some apparently insane way, sometimes there's a good reason for people to be behaving in a unexpected way. And I don't mean reason in the sense of the ordinary logical idea. I mean, there's a history that leads to the formation of purposes that lead to the necessity of their inaction for a person, and sometimes a group of people. Millions of people are suffering horribly right now, and some of them are old and sick, or some of them are badly injured. Some of them have no medical care. Some of them have no homes. Some of them are so poor that a tablespoon of rice would be like a month's wages. All over the world, and inside every one of those people, without exception, there's a process going on whereby that person is developing. They are learning internally in the way that only an individual organism can, though they are not merely individual organisms, and that learning is informed by the people around them, their culture, their language, the priorities and values of the people around them, and so on. But in the privacy of our own hearts, where we think no mind shall intrude, of course we're now sort of in danger of having our interiority profiled by machines, and that's a really serious danger. That's something we need to pay very close attention to and reject outright. Unless we're stuck with it, in which case we better use it very carefully and intelligently and with great reservation and concern. Oh, the scent of these flowers. Oh, incredible. So if someone is sick or injured, we might be able to visually tell. But when people are feeling pain emotionally and psychologically, we may understand that something's, out of, how shall we put it, that there's a conflict going on inside the person in their mind. And those conflicts can be very fraught, and those are often the result of various kinds of long-term suffering that has gone unacknowledged, unaddressed, or even blamed on the person suffering, because this is one of the, this is one of the cool modern moves, is to either pretend that the person is masquerading as suffering in order to gain quote-unquote attention, which, by the way, if someone was doing that, it might be fairly obvious that they're not receiving the beggar's share of attention that we each need to be human. Unless, of course, we're hermits or monks or something. But either they're playing a game to get attention, and again, it's not that we want to throw the idea away, but we should be very suspicious of the way it often gets crudely employed. They should be tougher, right? Life is hard. Your life is hard. So, toughen up. Or one of 7 other popular bullshit moves that our culture trains us to make as children. We begin to play with making these judgments and declaring them, asserting them in childhood, most of us. Some resist it, which is awesome and beautiful. And some of those people, go on to help others resist it, which is even better. And looks something a bit more like being human. But in a competitive context, there's a lot of incentive to judge and demoralize and dominate and overcome others. Most of us who are listening have deep experience of profound emotional suffering. And yeah, there are different depths, lots of different depths, and it goes very, very deep. And there's also you can have a lot of suffering if you just have enough sort of shallow, superficial emotional suffering to keep you from being able to feel anything like your humanity or your depth at all, right? Suffering doesn't have to be terrible for it to be torture. And by torture, I mean lots of different things, but one of the things I clearly mean is to be deprived of the capacity for our inner developmental process, our self, our being, to educate and develop and express itself throughout all of its life phases, and there are certainly more than 4. And they don't necessarily happen in the same order for everyone, by the way. So yeah, it was just occurring to me as I was entertaining another topic, it suddenly occurred to me that what a terrible that since we cannot see the suffering of others, and we do not know from their interiority to our own what they've been through, are going through. And if you've done any work at all in the sector that provides therapy for people of any kind, you will immediately be divested of the standing illusion that the people around you are all okay. Because I'm not sure if any of them are okay. And many of them are suffering with burdens that would be extremely unlikely for any of us to imagine the pain of. And part of what that pain is, and it's not the only part, is they are deprived of themselves. Right? They're not merely deprived of meaningful social and relational and, creative roles together. They're deprived of their own interiority. They can no longer really feel that process of burgeoning, growing, learning, sensing, discovering, playing, knowing, loving, interiority, right? The place where the real stuff happens that nobody talks about because it's the thing that allows us to be able to talk. And we don't really know how to talk about that. But it's in there, in all of us. And when we say we love someone, part of what we mean is we love that. We love the invisibles of them. Yeah. Their invisibles are beautiful, and in many cases anyway, and it's the same is true if we love a plant or an animal or a living place. It's not that we love the surface of them, though, we might really like that too. It's that we love the invisibles of them. And this is the thing our language and our habits with our language is almost well, we never discuss this. Right? If you want to pretend there's no metaphysics and pretend there are no invisibles that are meaningful, you're going to be in a really strange position on move 2. And it's going to be a position that ends up looking a lot like a machine, I think, but maybe not necessarily. Many of us carry scars and burdens, injuries and illnesses that are completely invisible to those around us, and those around us cannot muchly help us with them, with the exceptions that there are. And there are some. And so most of the people we see are in pain, and they may be in agony. And many of them are isolated even within their relationships and families and cultures and societies. And this is, by the way, the primary origin of drug use, abuse, alcoholism, all these things. It comes from this one place. It comes from first people becoming isolated, and they may have some role in that process, but the context is severe in its capacity to potentiate this, right? The context is so well structured to potentiate loneliness and isolation that wealth will not protect you from it, right? And neither will fame, or what we think of as good fortune. Now again, when we speak of the people in general, we're talking about such an incredibly deep and diverse population, right? So there's all these little threads and streams of authenticity and beauty and creativity, and some of them are momentary and some of them are lasting. But all of them are sort of being hunted by the sort of industrial, technological infrastructure that is something like the estranged shell of what humans might have become if, and I'm just going to let that if resonate. If instead of this we So the really deep tragedy, the really deep pain, is to be isolated from one's own interiority, from our own inner process, from our relationship with ourself. And it sounds like a weird thing, like, how do I have a relationship with, what is it? What do I have, two me's? Right? I have the experiencing me and the relating me or something? I don't know. But there is something like a relationship with oneself. And to be deprived of this is agony. You can be making $500,000 a month. If you don't have this, you will be in agony. And the common people who are not wealthy, it's easy enough to torture them with jobs and concerns and bizarre socio-political nonsense and language and bad ideas about important features of being human. And the failure to embody those features together or enact them. Or in fact, even the standing practice of counterfeiting them, stealing them, counterfeiting them, and then selling us back dead representations that are uninhabitable and divide us further from ourselves and each other. Let that ring for a moment, because that one statement is is staggeringly profound when we understand it, right? When we see that something in our collectivity, or perhaps, and I think this is, both perspectives are valuable, there's something in our collectivity, and we inherit it, right? It's not like we assembled this, we were born into it, most of us, so we learn to normalize it. We think of it as ordinary and normal. But there's something in our collectivity that is stealing something from our souls, representing that thing, counterfeiting it, selling it back to us as convenience or fashion or necessity, right? Oh, this is how it has to be. Because life is hard and so on and so forth, and there are bad people in the world and so on and so forth. Weirdly, a lot of the bad people are the people who want us to be really worried about other bad people, but that's another topic. It's wrong. All of this is terribly wrong and should never be this way, even for one more minute. It should never have become this way. It's anti-human. It's anti-organismal. It's anti-life. It's the opposite of being ensouled beings. Beings with an invisible, essential interiority. We can change the language. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be particularly metaphysical. We just need to realize there's a great big mystery swarming around in there, and we're not likely to dismiss it with mechanical descriptions, for it will never be encompassed by them, nor will it be encompassed by language. And this is an old dream of an aspect of our humanity, right? To get a grip on the essential structure of what it means to be human. And that imperative corrupts our intelligence, because it's inclined to evict anything it cannot encompass, reduce to a representation, and manipulate in waking consciousness. And trust me when I tell you that probably less than 1% of our humanity is of that ilk. It can be handled that way meaningfully. Whatever we are, it's mostly mystery. And it's invisible to our common ways of thinking and looking and evaluating. It doesn't mean we can never explore it. We can, and we must, we should. But again, to do so requires either a profound act of personal will, which in some cases succeeds, or contexts that nurture and support us in that process. And strangely, ironically, or I don't know, anti-ironically, this conversation, and I call it a conversation because I know it will move the minds of those who listen to it. Right? So their invisible interiority will become somewhat involved, somehow involved with mine. I'm on the big hill now. This conversation is a momentary emergence of the kind of context I'm describing. And that's a very special kind of magic. And I want to be clear that it's quite difficult to use language in this way. And most of the time, if I manage to succeed, somehow I got lucky. It's very difficult, it's much more difficult to plan to do that. I've always stumbled into it when it happens. And that's a grace. And I think that grace is associated with having a selflessly noble purpose. And I'm not claiming that I have no self-interest here, but rather that I'm speaking about and to the heart of my people as all the people. Right? I'm speaking in an unusual position where I'm speaking for the unspoken interiority of all of the people and all of the living beings, because my heart is moved to, not because I want $1 or I'm hoping someone will think this or that about me. And all children carry within them imperatives, many of which are exquisite, and most of which will be shut down for most of those children. There are occasional exceptions, but often the exceptions pay a very high price for their for embodying the unspoken interiority of our humanity. So, there are some things that to speak about them is to embody them together, to consider them together deeply, actively, is to embody them. Because they will, in so doing, we will transform our values, our priorities, and those values and priorities which we will reject and say, these are not human. These values and priorities are not human. And, a critic will come along and say, well, plenty of humans enact them, so if they're not human, I don't know what is. There are two different definitions of human. One, what do the prisoners do in the prison? What's their behavior? That's the critic's position. Two is the critic's position. The behavior of the humans in the context that punish authenticity and incentivize defection and counterfeiting and all of this stuff. And of course, this is just one way of talking about it. I'm not saying we should take all of what I'm saying literally, but the first one is our interiority, right? The priorities and values that are not entirely intrinsic until they become embodied in a human being, usually in childhood, but sometimes later. Again, we have this map of development that presumes it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. Nope. Sometimes it goes 4, 1, 2, 3. Humans are strange. And our development is much different than what we imagine, and there's multiple streams of it at all times. And those streams are in different phases, and under various kinds of pressures, they will shift phase. Also under various kinds of opportunity, right? The interiority, that interior process, is extremely sensitive to threats and opportunities. And so this is part of why contexts are so crucial. Forming an agreed space together for the pursuit of our interiority and the expression and understanding and recognition together, what that's all about, right? Wow, what a crazy view. It's night, way up on a steep hill, and I can see the airport and much of South San Francisco and places with other names. So the critic is confused, right? Because they're saying, look, humans are doing all this stuff. Why? So you don't think that's human? No, I think that's standard behavior in prison-like anti-contexts. or at least it's common, whether or not it's standard. Others have said this, but it's very clear to me that many, if not most, forms of addiction are the result of isolation, deprivation, both of meaningful roles in relationships with others and eventually, for many of us, the branches on the tree of our interiority keep getting cut off, inhibited. Eventually they stop growing. And it's a terrible agony. Some of us are either somewhat well equipped or stumble into or chase down the capacity to reestablish meaningful interiority, play, creativity, wonder, learning, awe, reverence, joy, terror. Anxiety doesn't necessarily disappear, but at least the salad's got some other components. I think we may fail to realize just how profoundly disorienting isolation is for an animal as social, as innately social as our kind of animal. And again, rather than me saying all people are this way, what I'm saying is each person is uniquely like this, some more than others in some ways, and some less than others in some ways. And we change over time, and we change in circumstances, we change in context. So, many people who think, I'm not social, I don't like people, it might really have a lot to do with just having had really bad experiences of counterfeit contexts in which cruelty was a consistent result of the behaviors of the group. And not just cruelty, all kinds of other things. Embedded ignorance, dominance, hierarchies, all kinds of crap. And some of the things are like plus sign things where someone's actively being vicious, and some of the trouble is minus sign things where no one is being kind. Right? So I think it just struck me before I left my house that I feel great sorrow for the modern people in general who are suffering and alone, injured or sick, elderly or rejected. And even the common people in their nice cars and pretty houses, many of them are carrying pain, fear, shame. Many of them are isolated even within their families. Many of them are isolated from themselves. So, there's lots of really important material surrounding what I'm highlighting here. And some of that material, in my view, relates very deeply to a fundamental polarity in our human nature. And in my view, from my perspective, you know, when I choose to hold this one, I can hold others. This polarity is really mythic in the sense that it's so primordial and nothing escapes its influence. And although I'm going to speak in a relatively binary fashion, I'll talk about perhaps I'll use the waking mind, dreaming mind analogy, but it's not a very good one. I need a better one. One of the aspects of ourselves wants graspable, predictable structure. And the other aspect of ourselves is very interested in flow and developmental efflorescence, blossoming. And for the one that likes structure, for the aspect that likes structure, blossoming is more structure. Right? It's winning for that one. The other one doesn't care much about competitions, I don't think. Could be wrong, but I doubt it. From what I know of its character, it's not that it won't show up to compete in meaningful ways, but it's very skeptical of zero-sum games and stuff that ends in hard structure. Because it knows those as prisons. So there are these two aspects. And of course, you know, there's 7 aspects, or there's 15. But I'm going to generalize down to these 2 to keep it simple at the moment. And this problem that we have with the counterfeiting and the cruelty and the isolation from ourselves and all of these things that I was turning my mind toward, they're deeply related to this inner conflict. And in the waking world, the structured one has the upper hand, and our cultures are forged in the likeness of some of its least desirable qualities. And those cultures are, in the words of Daniel Schmachtenberger, though I'm sure he didn't coin the phrase, they're self-terminating. Hi there.
Help.
Hi.
Help.
Hi. One moment. Actually, I didn't do them enough injustice. They're self and other terminating. They're world terminating. We used to be able to get away with them as a species because our populations were small. The Earth was large in comparison. So we could pretend that we could just, the Earth could absorb infinite damage, and so could we. Or both, you know, that, and this is a common myth of the structured aspect. The Earth can absorb infinite damage, and we aren't the Earth. We are separate from the Earth, so we don't really have to worry about that. Which, you know, if something like that happened biologically in our bodies, we wouldn't live for more than a few seconds. If one of our organs decided it was just going to eat all the others and package them up in little plastic boxes, and, you know, we wouldn't get very far at all. But the Earth was vast, and humans were still young in number, which in a way is also young in time, but I don't have time to explain that idea at the moment. So we live in what is very much like a myth. And there's different ways to frame the myth. And we might use different ways for different purposes to highlight different facets of the situation, our situation, our nature. That we both are born into in the sense of a vast amount of inheritance genetically and from lineages and lineages of living beings and with language and culture and so on. We had all these inheritances. But some of our assets are innate and unique to each person, you know. Someone will have a particular sensitivity for living things, living beings, creatures. Someone else will not, but may be profoundly well suited to work on engines or computers or in mathematics or physics. Diversity is one of our most astonishing features as an animal. And we keep inventing new branches into which we can diversify. Unfortunately, most of them are co-opted from the outset. But not all of them. So there's this myth playing out, and one of the only people I've come across who's got a beautiful way and a very intelligent way of illuminating this is Iain McGilchrist. In his book, The Master and His Emissary, I think the subtitle is The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. And we don't have to believe everything McGilchrist says. But we should very carefully attend his perspective about the two aspects. And again, there's not just two, but we're simplifying. It's interesting that we have to actually go to sleep for one of them to wake up most of the time. The flowing one, the water child. It's almost as if there's the water child and the object child. The object child wants everything structured, orderly, manipulable. And as we should realize, our invisible interiority, you'll have to kill us to get it to do that. It's not going to do that. It's not like that. Its nature is different from that. And I think, part of the agony, part of the pain and the suffering that we feel in isolation from others and ourselves is too much dead structure, right? It's not meaningful to have possessions when we don't have relationships. See, this is the problem in a nutshell. Though there are those who can, how shall I put this? There are those who can somewhat satisfy themselves with transactions, right, instead of relationships. Oops, I'm going down the wrong street. Well, let's see, there's a fiction in language, right? That the street I'm going down is wrong. Such tricky stuff. Seems totally ordinary. what I meant was that street won't lead me where I wish to go. But it might have led me somewhere I needed to go, except that I turned around and I'll take the street I know. See the problem? I wonder what would happen if I went on that other street. But habits and agendas, right, like my own, they affect the route we travel. They affect our route selection, and I'm going to birdwalk for just a minute here and talk about this. Because the dreaming mind, the water child, so to speak, is interested in adventure and wonder and learning. But it's also, it's got fears and concerns of its own. They're not as formalized as the waking minds. And it's much more flexible. It's so much more flexible that it doesn't actually really care. It seems to be oriented toward the invisible interiority of things, right? Rather than the superficial structure. So that, for example, in a dream, I could see a man and know that was my sister. And I might have a little bit of, my waking consciousness, the metal child, the object child, might start to get a little bit antsy about that in the dream. And say, like, that's really weird. My sister doesn't usually look like that, but I know it's her anyway. So the water child in us gets hurt badly by culture, in everyone. And there are artists and performers who speak for it and who embody it and enact it. But we need the opportunity. We don't need it represented back to us, though that can be inspiring and renewing in the right context. It isn't always. If we're just spectating, it's just going to be another transaction, right? I went and saw the performance. But if we become deeply engaged, then somehow the water child gets nourished while we are awake. And that's a beautiful moment. So you can see that the object child that likes language and concepts and math and structure and technology and commerce and would prefer transactions to relationships, they're more expedient, more convenient. Actually, what I meant was the object child, in case I didn't get that right. This one dominates most of our experience. I'm walking around, everything around me is structure. All boxes with windows and cars and pavement, fences, right? That's the physical signature of the object child. But that's just the local signature, because the social signature is filled with laws and proclamations and assertions and refutations and admonitions and demands. That's also the object child. It's not pretty, but worse, it's not human. I have 10 fingers. Without, the great irony here is that the object child is founded in the water child, but kind of doesn't like it, to put it mildly. And in some cases, in some people, would prefer that we do away with all of that and just get down to the hard structure, the concrete deliverables. Every animal that was ever hit by a car knows about those concrete deliverables. It's the last thing they probably ever knew, other than terrifying agony and wrongness, injustice, terrible injustice. And we are animals, and we get hit by cars, and we get killed in cars. But for most of us, the prevailing sort of parahypnotic continuum of society and culture keeps us asleep, inhibited, isolated. We have great big electronic screens on which we watch people having interactions or being human. And, the young people, I mean, they're so what? They're so energized and alive that some of them will develop buffers, but most of them will be really badly compromised by this over time. But they know that the structure's bullshit. They know it's a big lie. And it's one of the things, that knowledge is one of the things that, one of the variables that funds their self-destructiveness. Because they look around at a world they didn't make and don't want to inherit and don't believe in the values or priorities of. And they think to themselves, well, if that's what being human is, I'll burn very brightly, even if it's very briefly. We see plenty of this, too much, all over. And it happens to the adults too. The adults aren't immune to that kind of thinking. But the teenagers are, 9, 10, 11, 12, and on through the teens and young adulthood. If you talk with them, and of course each person will be unique and you'll have a vast variety of experience, but they'll tell you straight up, this is wrong. What we're doing is wrong. It's bad. It's not human. It's not good. One of the great elder gum trees in my neighborhood, it's just enormous, and it grows right out of it blocks almost the entire cement. It's just growing on this corner of the street on what would be the sidewalk, and it's just exquisite. It's huge and old, and it completely interrupts the structure, right? It just blatantly sticks out as, the living world busting through the concrete and dominating it. The humans have allowed this great old tree to stay here so long. It's very precious, this tree, to me. Most of the religions are actually about the story of the water child. And when you hear talk of demons and things like this, one of the things you're hearing, it might not be the only thing, you're hearing the story of people that know what happens when the object child dominates societies. It brings apocalypse. It's a world-ending aspect of our humanity. Because, now it doesn't have to be. So, yes, this mythic scenario is playing out uniquely in all of us and in our culture and on our planet. And it's endlessly rich, this terrain, right? We could explore it till we die and not get past a fifth of it. Not get to a thousandth of it, probably. But the goal isn't to indict the object child, right? The goal is to get the object child to play nicely with its own origin. Because the way that this child plays, if it gets too much power and off on its own and isolated from its origin, is it plays very serious zero-sum games. And it's unaware, it doesn't, it's either unaware or it doesn't care that will result in its own ending. Because when the water child that is giving rise to it ceases to be, then it disappears like a phantom, and it has this fantasy that it can overcome the water child, right? That it can do the things the water child does better. Right? It doesn't need that other thing. It's like my pinky saying it doesn't need my body. Right? I'm a really powerful pinky. I can build machines and destroy things, and nothing can stop me. So we're in a really weird situation. It's very science fiction-y. It's very mythic. And we don't want to get rid of the object child. We want to bring the two children back together so that they can, let us say, the right one, or no, it's not right. The appropriate leader is recognized, and we can shift without losing our awareness of the water child to some of the capacities of the object child, in a way where they don't become world-ending, right? They don't become self-terminating because they're overseen by the water child's awareness of life and the invisibles of life and interiority and nature. So if the object child is encompassed in that way, something really astonishing happens. The first thing is it stops acting like a monster. It stops acting like a demon. And the second thing is it gets vastly better at what it does because it no longer has to compete against its own origin to do anything at all. Right? If one of those has to win, we're screwed. Right? And the water child doesn't care about winning, so it won't even show up for that. So one of the directions forward is, first of all, the recognition and reemergence of what I'm referring to as the water child in our common experience and relationships and thought and learning and creativity and so on. And then the other is the retrieval of the object child from the strange vacuum of that is produced by its how shall I put it? That is produced when it's placed in competition with its origin. The object child actually has the capacity for profound heroism and beauty, but only when it's encompassed by the water child. Because if it is not, then the produce of its work will be used to kill and torment and counterfeit and represent, and like those two words sort of go together for me, because the representation is an inauthentic replica of something. There are exceptions. It's not the only way to think about it, but so the goal is to sort of retrieve the object child from its dissociated fugues of, world-dominating intent, and return it to the embrace of its origin and twin. It's a tall order, but it's only tall if we make if the scope is large, if the scope is vast, right? If the scope is all the people, yeah, that's a tall order. If the scope is you and me together in this moment, we can do that. We can get there right now, right? We can bring the water child back into the conversation. We can create contexts where it's safe, or not necessarily safe, but supported, encouraged, rewarded. And that will always benefit us whenever we're capable of making that agreement together. People say things, it's impossible to change the world. Well, it might be impossible to change the whole world right now, but it's not impossible to change our world together for the next hour. We can do that really easily. And that's where we can begin to learn and see how we might approach broader scales of transformation, and maybe have some hope about returning our people to a path that is in tune with, in harmony with our nature and our interiority. Because yes, if you torture us, our nature expresses that, and it gets ugly. But when we're not tortured and we're not fighting, humans are pretty peaceful in general. At least we certainly have the potential to enjoy a peace that all of our ancestors dreamt of and worked for. And the investment of their lives and hearts and souls is something I will not dismiss, ever. For it's alive in me, in my own heart, in my own spirit. I want for all human beings the chance for them to be human and have meaningful identities and roles and relationships, in spite of the bizarre cultures we find ourselves enmeshed in. Well, now my walk has ended. I'm grateful for you joining me, and I look forward to further conversations and discoveries. Thanks, everybody.